Hello, my name is Nairi, and I'm here to talk to you about knowledge and wisdom, spirituality, and empowerment. In my last video, I mentioned Alvin Toffler, who wrote the book Future Shock in 1970, and the fact that future shock was described as an illness that came out of too much change in too short a period of time. We need consistency in our lives. We need to feel safe. We need to know what we can rely on. And as the world is changing so dramatically, it's increasingly difficult, not only to know what we can rely on in terms of our physical environment, but to even know what's true. There's such an overload of information, it's hard to tell how much of that information is fact and how much of it is myth or imagination or public opinion. So how are we to negotiate this world where we're already in future shock, but it's not going to subside? We're moving into even greater rates of change. So how are we going to negotiate this? How are we going to survive as a species? Because with the development of artificial intelligence, with the rate of development of artificial intelligence, with all the social issues that are arising and the partisan beliefs of people, we really are moving into dangerous waters. How do we negotiate that? Well, there's a reason I'm talking about knowledge, wisdom, spirituality, and empowerment, because knowledge is power. Knowledge is power. The problem is, how do we know what knowledge is? How do we understand that? You know, when I was a little girl, maybe 5 or 6 years old, I remember lying in bed at night, hearing what I believed, firmly believed, were the stars twinkling up in the sky. Because in my child's mind, I had no conception of planets and outer space. There were simply little lights in the sky that were called stars, and I believed they twinkled. It wasn't until a few years later that I discovered that this twinkling noise was actually possums running along the roof. But in my child's mind, I believed that. Now, because as an adult, I know that we live in outer space, or I believe that, and that those twinkly stars are actually planets millions of light years away, I think I would find it quite distressing if I suddenly discovered that's not true, that physical environment is very different. I saw a video yesterday that was quite interesting. Somebody had done a street survey and they were asking young women whether they believed men could have babies, and a surprising number of them said yes, men can have babies. Now, where does a thought like that come from? It doesn't come from knowledge. It can't come from knowledge, because all of those of us who are realistic about the world know that only the female of the species can have babies. Naturally, anyway. Even more disturbingly, a recent video I saw showed a survey done of a group of children around 5, 6, 7 years old. These children were from different racial backgrounds, and they were shown a picture of 5 avatars, 5 faces, identically the same face. On the right was one that was very dark-skinned, on the left one that was light-skinned, and then 3 gradations in between. And these children were asked questions like, who's the good person? Who's the bad person? Who's the beautiful person? Who's the intelligent person? And the results were quite shocking, because the stereotypes that these children came up with were almost universal. Both black and white-skinned children agreed or pointed to a dark-skinned child as being unintelligent, evil, ugly, and the white-skinned child as being beautiful, intelligent, and so on. Now, I don't know which demographic these children belong to, but it doesn't matter. This is not, their responses are not based on knowledge. They're based on the collective myths of whichever demographic, whichever group they belong to. So how do we know what we know? How do we decide that? Really, it brings us to the issue of brainwashing and critical thinking. How do we know when we've been brainwashed, and how do we know when we're thinking critically? And what is critical thinking? We tend to think the word critical means to criticise, to negate, to destroy. But critical thinking is not about destroying anything. Critical thinking really means to analyse, to work out whether something is true or not true. If it's true, then your knowledge is that it's true. If it's not true, then you know it's not true. But that's a really hard one to define. When I was in high school, in my biology class, I was taught, along with most students in schools in those days, in the 1960s, that Charles Darwin's theory of evolution was a proven fact. We were taught the theory of evolution, a lot of time was spent on it. And it was taught as scientific fact, and yet even Charles Darwin himself said that if it could ever be proved that the cells in the body were irreducibly complex, in other words, they couldn't break down, then his theory would fall apart. Now, Darwin said that himself, and apparently at the end of his life he actually negated his own theory, and yet all those years later we were taught this as fact. And science has proven that the cells of the body are irreducibly complex. You only would have to change one tiny aspect of the cell and the whole thing could well collapse. So that negates the theory. But isn't it interesting that for so long we were taught it as science? Now, all science is theory. No science, you can demonstrate that something is true, but you can never say that something is incontrovertibly true. And it brings me back to Walter Lippmann, who I also mentioned in my last video. Walter Lippmann wrote a book called Public Opinion, in which he described most of our belief systems as simply being opinion. And he describes it insofar as once you have large numbers of people, hundreds of thousands, millions of people, none of us can know all the facts related to the issues in our collective lives. So we tend to rely on other people's reporting of those facts. And it requires a leap of faith, because you have to believe that those people are saying what they're saying, that what they're saying is true. And this becomes a big problem for us. And yet we have to live in a collective world. None of us are any longer just isolated within our own countries. We belong to the greater world now. What Lippmann said was that each of us brings our own personal biases to everything we believe, depending on our culture, depending on our family experience, depending on the history of the culture we belong to, many things that bring our own personal biases. So he says that we basically think archetypally. He uses the words archetype. We have archetypal belief systems. So you may archetypally believe that all people in a certain racial group are evil, or all people that belong to a particular religious group are evil. You get the picture. He said this because I referred to Charles Darwin and science, and now let's look at the social issues that are important to our knowledge of the world. And I'll quote from Lippmann. He said, "At the core of every moral code, there is a picture of human nature, a map of the universe, a version of history. To human nature, of the sort conceived, in other words, how you believe, the way in which you believe human nature is, in a universe of the kind imagined, in other words, what kind of universe do you believe in? After a history so understood, in other words, the history you've been taught, the rules of the code apply, that is, the moral code of your group." And then he goes on to say later, "But in the codes that are under the influence of science, the conception is known to be an hypothesis, whereas in the codes that come unexamined from the past or bubble up from the caverns of the mind, the conception is not taken as an hypothesis demanding proof or contradiction, but as a fiction accepted without question." He goes on to say further, "In the one case, a man is humble about his beliefs, that is, the scientist, because he knows they are tentative and incomplete. On the other, he is dogmatic because his belief is a completed myth." And I can't help reflecting on the words of a certain medical, political figure who kept saying, with regard to the COVID pandemic, "Trust the science, trust the science." The whole point about science is that you don't trust the science. You look to it for possible guidance, but science doesn't have the answer to anything. True science is only about questions. So Lippmann talks about this mythological thinking. So I ask the question, what myths do we believe in? What myths do we believe in collectively? What are our archetypal thinking patterns about the collective myths of the whole of the human species? For instance, if you look at all the things being discussed on social media at the moment, if you look at things broadcast in the news, what mythical, I say mythical because they're propositions, what things are important to us at the moment? Climate change is the latest one, gender issues, education, the nature of education, pharmaceuticals and health, spiritual beliefs, partisan politics or politics in general, our collective history, and science. Who decides that those are important matters for us to be discussing? Who decides that? Do you decide that? Do I decide that? Where did you first hear about climate change? Where did you first hear about that? Did you think about climate change 30 years ago if you were alive then? Why is it an issue? What is it? What is climate change? The climate's always been changing. So what do we mean by climate change? Or is this just a tool to manipulate us into certain beliefs that might lead to greater control over our lives? This is a really scary one right at the moment. What about education? The education system I was brought up in was retrospectively really strange, because in my final year of school I was taught a group of subjects that had no relevance to anything. I enjoyed them: maths, biology, language, literature, and and geography because I couldn't think of anything else. But with regard to my lifetime, I don't know how valuable they were, even though they were fun to study. But we need to look at changes in education. Why do we believe we need to send children to school? What are schools there for? Well, you may well be aware that schools were developed during the Industrial Revolution. Why? Because until the Industrial Revolution, most people worked on the land. But if you're going to develop industry, you need workers. And the problem with people working on the land is they don't have clocks. They work by the sun and the moon and by nature. They're not disciplined people. You need to train those people who have no discipline into a disciplined way of thinking. And of course, when I was at school, I don't know if it's still like that, but when I was at school, we had to wear a school uniform. I was put into a marching squad. We had to obey a bell. When the bell rings, you come to class. When the bell rings, you can leave class. Everything was highly structured. Our classes were formal. It was a rigid, disciplined environment, and we learned our lessons really well, and my generation were really good at that. We were taught maths, we were taught reading and arithmetic. But you don't need to go to school to learn those things. If your parents know those things, if the people around you know those things, you learn them as part of your life process. So, what are the discussions in education about? Politics. Why do we have partisan politics? Why do we have two political parties? Do you ever ask yourself, why two political parties? It's right and left, good and bad. In America, red and blue. Why? Are there only two options of thought in terms of how we run our world? Here's another one about politics. Why have governments involved themselves in our private lives when originally governments were there to deal with the economy, to deal with the way our finances are arranged, to ensure that we collectively, in terms of business, work well together. Governments were diplomatic entities. How does your country relate to another country? You need diplomatic relations with other countries. Those big pictures were what governments were originally formed for. But now, for many years now, in the country I come from, Australia, there have been government departments that put money into the arts. And I can remember when this happened. I was in my early 20s when suddenly the government decided that it should put a certain amount of money away to support the arts. Which arts? Who decides which arts deserve money to be poured into them? Art has nothing to do with control and government. Art is a personal expression. Art is what comes from inside us. Giving money to the arts is just playing a political game, really. And I know a lot of people will disagree with me. The arts are important. Yes, they are important. But you can't control their nature. Once you start funding anything, you have control over that entity. So I'll give you money if you create artworks that support my government's point of view about what the arts are. It's destroying itself. It's a double-edged sword. And so it goes on. So those are things to think about. The nature of knowledge and the mythological beliefs that we bring to our knowledge. How do we negotiate those things? I'm going to keep talking about these issues in future videos, along with spirituality and empowerment, because Empowerment is a big question. Yes, knowledge is power, but how do we find knowledge? How do we empower ourselves? Those are huge questions, and we all need to answer them very soon. In the meantime, if you want to see a little bit about my background, I have a website, nairij.com, NGAIRE.com, nairij.com. You're welcome to have a look at that. You can find out a little bit about me there, but I'm an artist and a musician, so you can see some of my art and some samples of my music. In the meantime, stay well, stay blessed. Thank you for spending time with me, and I'll see you next time.